and during the war it was requisitioned by the government and trained Norwegian resistance.
Right.
David, we were discussing Iraq and
Yes,
what is
yes.
what is being done to it. I mean, I think the United States ultimately would see that as a victory, that they have destroyed a state with a large independent army and balkanized that region again, like they did in Yugoslavia.
Yeah.
And increasing, one feels that the political strategy is smaller is better because they are easily controllable. So they don't necessarily see these things as defeats. And if you study some of the NATO documentation on Afghanistan, you know, they're now saying, well, the importance of the bases is that they're on China's borders.
Yeah.
And the Afghan people are not our concern. You know, that was, we got rid of Osama and all that. And now we have to try and keep the bases there.
Right.
I mean, the point I'm making really is that they have suffered setbacks, and it's hardly a surprise, but there is no other state in the world which can even politically or ideologically challenge them, apart from South America, on which, of course, I agree.
But I was going to say, there are these signs of, you know, autonomy emerging in various regional configurations. And I think you're right that the United States is into a sort of divide and rule politics. But what does it want to divide, and how does it want to rule? I mean, I think the European Union, its approach to the European Union is very, very interesting because on the one hand, it does not want to divide it economically. It wants it to be an open territory economically, but it wants it to be politically divided. So keep it politically divided, but economically consolidated. And that's, I think, how they're backing off in Latin America. They're saying, letting everybody kind of, okay, we're not going to be too upset about the fact that Ecuador and Bolivia and Venezuela are doing the wrong kinds of things. I mean, we're going to intervene as much as we can, of course, for obvious reasons. But on the other hand, what we're most concerned with is maintaining an open field for economic activity and economic unity, which is why the US in the WTO and all of these other transatlantic agreements and Pacific agreements and so on become part of what the US is trying to do.
You know, during the Iraq War, I was in Germany at one point at a public debate with a professor from Yale. She was Donald Rumsfeld's advisor on international law. I said, answer me one question. Basically, there's a continuity from Reagan onwards in American economic and foreign policies. But on one thing, you have broken with the Clinton administration. And she said, what's that? I said, as far as I can gather, Clinton was quite keen, and Madeleine Albright visited North Korea to reunify the Korean peninsula and buy them out.
Right.
You people came in and stopped that in its tracks. Why?
Yeah.
And she gave me an amazing explanation. She said, well, look at it this way. You don't know the South Korean generals like we do. When they talk about reunification, you can see the glint in their eye. And the glint is that Korea will become a nuclear power.
Yes.
And she said, if Korea becomes, a unified Korea becomes a nuclear power, it will be impossible for us to deny the Japanese the bomb.
Yes.
And if China, Japan, and the Korean Peninsula are nuclear powers, that is very damaging to US interests. So we're not going to tolerate it. Simple as that, but not in public.
Yeah.
In other words, keep them divided.
Yes. No, that doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, I would accept that that is what the administration has been about, I think, over the... And this continues, I think, under Obama. I don't think there's any change.
Yeah, there's no change on that at all.
No.
David, in your book, 17 Contradictions in the End of Capitalism, in the middle of it, you come to a very, very interesting discussion about Marx and the Grundrisse, but you quote one thing in particular, which is Marx formulating something about freedom and the collective. And you quote Marx as saying, on the Jewish question, that the right of man to freedom ceases to be a right as soon as it comes into conflict with political life, whereas according to the theory, political life is only the guarantee of the rights of man, the right of individual man, and so must be given up as soon as it contradicts its end, these rights of man. And this was a reference to the French Revolution.
Yes.
Could you explain this, the debate?
I think, you know, that chapter about the relationship between domination and freedom argues that you can't have one without the other, and that it is a fantasy that somehow or other there's some freedom which is totally absent, dominating something. And the left, of course, has this. I mean, we will be very interested in total freedom, but not for the freedom of the bourgeoisie to rule and extract and appropriate most of the wealth of the world without any kind of challenge. So that on the one hand, you would want to have interventions which prevent, from the perspective I try to develop there, the private appropriation of social wealth. But in order to do that, you cannot have a system of untrammeled entrepreneurial freedom of property rights and the like. I think what struck me about the Iraq War, for example, was all of those speeches by Bush, which were about liberty and freedom, and that we're bringing liberty and freedom to the world by military means and by military interventions. And the aim was to dominate the world in the name of liberty and freedom. And then I'm kind of turning that around and saying, well, we want a real liberty and freedom, but in order to do that, we need the instruments of domination to be on our side, and we want to be able to dominate those people who would actually subvert popular freedoms and popular rights and our capacity to actually keep the social wealth social, as opposed to have it privately appropriated. So this is the framework in which I'm setting that up, and I think Marx understood that very, very well. And we shouldn't shy away from talking about this.
And you also refer in the book to the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, in which human rights are not only the obvious ones, the right to free speech, etc., etc., but there's a whole set of social rights which are completely ignored. The right to free health, free education, subsidized housing, etc., 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 which is never even mentioned.
No, I often think, you go and everybody goes on about, human rights and everything, and you kind of say, well, if you go back and look at those chapters of the UN Declaration which deal with those social rights, which of course also deals with rights to unionize, the rights to have a decent life in a decent living environment, and they've not been taken seriously at all.
One of the things in Limits of Capital, an earlier book, there was the sudden appearance of literature. It's filled with literary references which marked a break from your previous writings. I mean, French novelists are all there. What brought this about?
I found it very instructive that somebody like Raymond Williams, who I tend to admire quite a lot, took his social criticism to a certain point, but at a certain point he kind of said, there are issues here I can't deal with, and I need to deal with them in novel form. And then, of course, in this way, Marx is particularly in Volume 1, it's full of Shakespeare and Don Quixote and Balzac.
Amazing,
and
yes.
It's an amazing literary construction, and I've always enjoyed that aspect of Marx, and I thought, well, if he can enjoy writing it, I can enjoy writing that way too. So it's been and it's very liberating to be able to bring that perspective in.
And of course poetry, which in its early phases, when large numbers of people were illiterate, poetry was much more in direct communication with ordinary people.
And song too,
And songs,
popular
popular songs.
Yes, absolutely.
That's how people
Yes,
communicated
yes,
with
yes.
each other. And people knew poems by heart.
And of course, in many repressive situations, I mean, I remember if you look at some of the music that came out of Brazil during the military dictatorship, and it was very political. But they couldn't quite get hold of it. And of course, I did the study in Second Empire Paris, where a lot of political stuff was actually worked out through street songs and the like.
Talking about Paris brings us neatly to the latest fashion, which is that a French political economist, Thomas Piketty, social democrat of mild views. As he himself says, I admire capitalism greatly. I think the market is necessary. I think differentials are absolutely crucial, but they have reached an obscene level. That's his big criticism. He wrote a book in French which had no impact. Harvard translated it into English. Suddenly it exploded, and interestingly enough, made him a celebrity in France as well, which he wasn't before the Americans took out the book. So how do you, A, explain this sudden eruption of books like this, and the status they acquire, and the content?
You have to put it in context of a certain kind of logic, of political logic. I mean, if I locate it in the United States, for example, you couldn't talk about social inequality in the United States. It became a taboo subject. It was just absolutely off the agenda politically. Nowhere could we talk about it. Then along came Occupy Wall Street. And Occupy Wall Street actually put on the agenda in everybody's consciousness the question of the 1%. Who is the 1%? And so Occupy Wall Street actually did change the discourse in the United States. It brought it to, actually say, and it's very interesting that nobody before Occupy would understand what's meant by the 1%. Now, the slogan, the 1%, is universally understood. So what's the 1%? So that set the stage. And Obama's re-election campaign, for the first time, actually integrated, not very strongly, but began to talk about social inequality as an issue. Meanwhile, there were many people on the rather traditional kind of left, say somebody like Paul Krugman, who wanted to talk about social inequality, and Stiglitz, for example, who wanted to talk about. There were these people who really wanted to talk about social inequality but couldn't get very far. They could talk about the 1% and all the rest of it. And along came Piketty's book, and these guys kind of said, this is it, this is what creates the opening for us. So they promoted it, bang. Yeah. I mean, immediately Krugman kind of says, this is one of the most important books. Stiglitz says it is. Markovich says it, in other words.
So it took off.
So in other words, they saw this as a way of actually really consolidating the question of what about the 1%, because they were very, very frustrated by the way in which the crisis of 2007 and 2008 had been responded to. They felt, that it was all the wrong politics, and they were looking in a way to try to get out of their minority position and become majoritarian in terms of economic thinking. And I think there was a structured kind of almost liberal left of the United States Academy and elsewhere that seized upon the Piketty thing and said, this is what you've got to look at. This is what consolidates all of our arguments. So I think it was not just sort of an accident, it came out of a political process and became the vehicle for the reintroduction of this kind of question of social inequality into the political agenda.
And also, I mean, despite his own politics, he has got an amazing amount of research.
Yes, no, there's a lot of data in there.
Yes.
And what he did was to nail down a lot of stuff statistically, which then, of course, led to all of this attempt on the right to discredit his statistics in various kinds of ways. So I think it was the right book for the right time for the right project. But there was a political project in motion, which goes back to Occupy Wall Street, interestingly.
Yeah. As you were talking, I couldn't help thinking about another book written by people more left-wing than Piketty, but a book which also took off in a huge way, called empire.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
And whose political argument was essentially that there was no empire.
Yes.
And why do you think that took off?
Well, I think, I think the left, if you want to call it that, the broad left, was looking for what you might call a new way of conceptualizing politics, which was more consistent with the what was sometimes called the anti-globalization movement or the alter-globalization movement, the Seattle kind of generation. I mean, there was a politics coming out of that kind of said globally. And I think coming out of that was the notion that there are forms of oppression which can be identified almost everywhere in the world, and that it's not solely centered on the United States because, there are forms of oppression which are indigenous to, say, Brazil. The Brazilian upper classes are as much of a problem as, the IMF and all the rest of it. People started to look around in Mexico and said, well, my God, we have Carlos Slim, who's one of the richest people in the world, and he's Mexican, he's not American, and so why are we talking about US imperialism when we should actually be talking about Carlos Slim and the fact that there are more billionaires in Mexico than there are in Saudi Arabia? What's going on here? So there was I think a feeling that some alternative formulation was required in order to fit with the emerging politics of all of those sort of anti-IMF demonstrations, anti-G7 demonstrations, Genoa, Montreal, that kind of thing. And I think that book came out as, if you like, providing a bit of a philosophical underpinning for what was going on anyway. So again, I think you would kind of say the context was right for a book of that kind to come along and actually consolidate the way in which people thought.
David, I mean, without sounding ponderous, what do you think is the likely future of the planet? I mean, in terms of possibilities of emancipation, what its agents might be of such an emancipation, the ecology, the constant talk about the fight, the struggle for water, the huge movement of populations in Africa in particular. I mean, it's crying, the world is crying out for change.
Yes. I think, I mean, my view is that we are at a key inflection point in the history of capitalism. That it cannot continue along the paths that have been identified by industrial capitalism and, over the last century. And that something new has to come out. What has been so interesting to me about the response to the crisis of 2007, 2008 is that there's been almost no new thinking coming out at all. So you're at this inflection point where something's got to change, and you have no real coherent response by the ruling classes in terms of managing this in a way that's going to be responsive to those requirements of change, other than consolidating their own power. So they've been doing very well continuing to consolidate their own power. This seems to me to be an unstable situation, very unstable situation. And what is going to come out of it, I wish I had the crystal ball and I could tell you what it's going to be. But it's going to have to be something quite radically different. And there are some progressive forces right now which seem to me potentially dangerous in the sense that they seem to be progressive, but maybe what they're about is what I call a rebranding of capitalism. That we may be entering into a situation where we're trying to actually start to be able to talk, and we see this coming out in some literature now, ethical capitalism, conscience capitalism, cognitive capitalism, knowledge capitalism. In other words, there are progressive people who are talking this language, and in the same way that progressive people actually paved the way in some ways for the neoliberalization that came about in the 1970s, I'm very nervous about this, whether this is a progressive move on the part of segments of the left, or whether it's a move that is going to be co-opted and utilized by capital to define for itself an alternative way in which to consolidate even more of its own kind of political and economic power. At the same time, there are right-wing kinds of forces which we see in the sort of fascist revivals which are going on in Europe, and the rise of a kind of rabid right-wing republicanism in the United States, which
and
are
in
actually,
India.
Yes, and the election in India, which is kind of really scary. There are these forces which it seems to me are actually likely to destabilize the system in another kind of way. So I think we're at a very, very dangerous historical point. And my worry about it is that there's not enough coherent thinking and analysis going on to kind of say, what does this situation, what is it about, what does it mean? And what are the possible ways out of it? And if so, you know, is there a way in which the whole of humanity can actually look forward to some more emancipatory, not totally emancipatory, but more emancipatory future than the one that is now faced with? And that's the kind of question which is going to require a new way of doing politics. And I think a new way of thinking about what alternative forms of organization might look like. And there's a lot of work to be done. And my big problem right now is I don't see, for instance, universities training people to think through these issues. I see them training people to go into corporate finance and do just the same thing as they've always been doing. And there is this juxtaposition of the crying need for new formulations, new ways of thinking, new ways of doing politics. So that's the crying need is there, and there's a kind of almost soporific kind of response to it, and again that is unstable. But you know, things can change. Sometimes they change very fast.
Yeah.
And,
I mean, you know, what is obvious is that the planet needs planning.
Yes. Oh, yes.
And the word planning
Yes.
is a dirty word
Right. Yeah.
in the capitalist lexicon. Always was.
Yes.
And still is. But also politically, during the upsurges in Greece, in Europe, and the Arab world, I noticed one thing which was very striking and very different from the last 200 years of activity, which is that even when the masses, i.e. the people, and a huge majority of them had control of a city, as they did in Alexandria, as they did to a certain extent in Thessaloniki and even Athens, there was no automatic move to set up a popular council, to have a popular assembly, to say, okay, the town is ours, the city is ours, the security forces are not here, the police has been defeated, whatever. Let us try and organize this city as a model for the rest of the country. Yes. That is missing, i.e. politics.
Yes. No, I agree with that. And of course, part of the difficulty is certain philosophical attachments of elements of the left to pure horizontality, a refusal of any kind of hierarchy, a kind of almost a sort of fetish of certain conceptions of democracy that can't possibly work at the level of, say, a large metropolitan area like Athens, when you would want to say, how do we organize this whole city in such a way that it is actually emancipatory politics for the mass of the people, and how do we do that? And an unwillingness to actually contemplate that. And so, you know, there's I think that in a funny kind of way, a lot of the oppositional politics has become neoliberal.
Yes.
And it's almost a mirror image of that which it seeks to criticize. And my feeling is, if you've got a mirror image of this kind, then the only thing you can really do is smash the mirror. And I think that is the kind of thing we've got to be prepared to do, because otherwise we can't break out of this, what seems to me really dangerous inability to consolidate a new way of doing politics and a new way of thinking through the alternatives.
You know, one of the more interesting developments in recent decades was when the Argentinian economy collapsed, but literally
Right.
collapsed,
Yes.
and presidents were
Yeah.
changed every
Yeah.
fortnight. And in a huge city like Buenos Aires, which is the locals used to regard as the closest South America has to Europe,
Right.
but in any case, and we are always better than the rest of South America, suddenly in this city consciousness changed.
Yes.
And in every single part of it, there were gatherings, local assemblies where people would discuss how to help each other, including in the upper middle class and middle class parts of it. I mean, I was shocked. I was there during that. And my friend said, tonight we're not going to let you sleep till past midnight, and we want to show you something. So we kept up. And at midnight, middle and upper middle class kids came from certain localities, quite well dressed, wearing white gloves and scouring the waste bins outside the hotels.
Right.
And they said, this is not just for their families, it's for the collective.
Right.
So a horrific situation like that produced something, but nothing came of it on a permanent scale.
Right.
And that seems to be our problem.
Yeah. No, I mean, in Buenos Aires also, the barter networks sprang up, which encompassed some, several million people.
Exactly.
And this was an alternative monetary economy almost began to emerge. It was a pretty astonishing period. But you're right, then it faded away. But what we've been seeing is political activism of that sort. We've seen it in Gezi Park, we've seen it recently in Brazil, we've seen uprisings around the world, and they tend to be ephemeral.
Yeah.
And you keep on asking yourself the question, what would happen if they all stayed on the streets?
Yes.
What would happen?
Yes.
And one day they will, and
Yes.
then I think the new way of doing politics will just have to come into being. And that is, if you like, one of the big hopes I would have, that one day one of these uprisings which occurs like in Gezi Park, and people are out there in Istanbul, and then it goes to all the other cities in Turkey, and then everybody stays there and says we're not moving until we get an alternative politics and an alternative way of living being constructed.
On that happy note, we end.
Okay, great.
Very good to
All
see
right,
you.
good
Very
to see you.
be with
Thanks.
you. Thank you.